Good evening. We're going to sing a couple of songs and then turn things over to Mike. Mike Hammonds lives in Boston, Massachusetts with his wife Janet. How many years have y'all lived there? 25 years. Yeah, a long time. Met Mike at Lubbock when I was starting my senior year in college, and he became my mentor in the intern program there at the Sunset Church. And so whatever you see in me, he's to blame. But Mike and I have been friends for a long time, since 1978 or 77, and just have had a great relationship. And Mike's going to be speaking to us over the weekend about the church, our relationship to the church, God's plan for the church, and he's got some really great lessons planned, and we're just grateful that he's here. And we'll turn everything over to Mike right now.
One of my mother's favorite statements was this: "If you don't straighten up, I'm going to yank you bald-headed." And by the time I figured out she really didn't mean that, it was a life-changing event. There's lots of stories about that. And my objective this evening is to talk about the stories of our fellowship. It's the great thing that God has given us, and that is our relationships, our fellowship, and we get to build the God stories. And as we do this, our text this evening will be Acts chapter 18. And I'm going to be telling lots of stories. And I'm not calling attention particularly to things about me or my experiences, but I want you to hear those stories because they represent an application to drawing each one of us into our fellowship and the power and the significance of stories. A couple of years ago, my mother died, and a year before that, we put her in an assisted living facility. At the same time, it was my 50th high school reunion. I didn't want to go to either one. I didn't want any part of it. And obviously, I went ahead and went. And on my way to Roswell, where I'm from, I read an article in the New Mexico magazine called Cuentos y Carencia. It was an article written by a young lady who was doing her graduate work at Rice University. She was Native American, Hispanic, and she was homesick. She was ready to quit, give it up. And all of a sudden, she got a care package in the mail with tortillas, salsa roja, the smells, the experience of that. She said she immediately got up and fixed her favorite meal from this box. It took her back home, where she was confident, took her back to those good times, settled her down so that she could continue on. At my high school reunion, the phrase that was there all the time was, "Do you remember when?" And it wasn't emphasizing a walk down memory road. What it really meant were all the stories that got us where we are now. Like driving down North Main Street in my old 52 coupe on a double date, and it just snowed about a foot in Roswell, New Mexico, and doing a donut right in the middle of traffic and everything else. And we laugh and chuckle and all about that, but it takes me back to that place and time. Excuse me. When I took my mother to the assisted living facility, we were having dinner at a round table, and there were about 5 ladies there, all in their 90s. And they started telling stories about their husbands. And they're laughing and chuckling. And one of them, Leona, said, "Well, I've been married 3 times and shacked up twice." And I said, "Leona, there are not that many men in Roswell." She said, "Well, 2 of them were from Ruidosa." And my mother and the other ladies that were there were just chuckling and slapping, their legs. And my mother never did anything like that. And I kind of thought, you know what? I can let my mother over to these stories. And so the word cuentos means stories. The word querencia means where they come from. And that's what tonight's lesson will be on. Cuentos are stories or intergenerational knowledge transferred from one disciple to another. The stories help us make sense of the church and ministry and our place in it. They help us connect with the living and remember the dead so we are never alone. The stories offer wisdom accumulated over years of experience. The word querencia means the way we feel connected to a particular landscape and community. It's a sense of rootedness, a place where you know you belong. It's your haunt. It's the place you love, where you want to be and where you want to die. Now, querencia can be physical or spiritual. And I'll tell some stories about the physical piece of that. But the spiritual piece is where we want to land, because the church is our querencia. It's the place that we're connected to. It's the place of a particular landscape and community. It's rootedness. It's the place where you know you belong. It's the place where it's your haunt. It's me. There can be a number of querencias through life. And sometimes I just wish I was guilty of what I'm accused of, if you ever been there. But I think back about the stories from when I first met Michael. And it's those stories in that querencia, in that place, which has driven my ministry for the last 50 years. It's that important. It's rootedness. I'm an elder and one of the preachers at the Natick Church of Christ, which is about 10 to 12 miles due west of Boston. It's not an urban church, but it's right on the edge of it. And we're building stories. Sometimes I tell the brothers, look, I've got enough on you and enough stories on you, you just better be careful. But it's true. So I'm after the stories, I'm after the querencia. I'm going to use some Spanish phrases this evening, which I believe communicate the intimacy and the emotion that surrounds our fellowship. Things like, como había antes, which means how things were before, with an eye open to the future. Many times we look at the viejos, the old ones, who tell the stories about back then. Like my dad used to say, he rode his donkey uphill to school and rode it uphill back home. And sometimes we think those stories about the old times are really not worth anything because they don't apply to today. We're going to erase that. Those stories about what went on back there with a view to what it would become. If we don't tell the stories, then the next generation has no benefit from who we are. And I'm telling you, we have a responsibility as older brothers and sisters to tell the stories. That's the hope of it, because those are the God stories. That's where we meet our care package, if you will. That's what carries us through. In Acts chapter 18, with that introduction, I want to talk about three things that I believe have a great application to our church today. In fact, I was thinking earlier, before I start, if your shepherds don't mind, I'd like to place membership here for the next 3 days, so I can be a closer part of your story and you mine. So we draw closer in our fellowship. Amen. I appreciate that. Acts chapter 18, three things. Number one, new friends become old friends. Number two is hospitality. And number three is the ministry. And I'd like to tell a number of stories as we go through this. Paul comes to Corinth, and he meets a couple, meets Aquila first, who's a tent maker just like Paul is. And I don't think Aquila and Priscilla ever got a notice that there was going to be a church planting in Corinth. God arranged that. And so they hook up and Paul moves in with them. And it's not very long before Silas and Timothy show up. And so now Priscilla and Aquila have 3 house guests. And I want to talk through this a little bit. I want to make it sort of a language that describes what actually went on. My imagination, however, what I'm going to describe is the things that have happened to Janet, my wife, and I over the years, particularly when we planted a church in western Massachusetts in 1981, where we had college students and young single professionals come and stay with us. And I can remember Janet pulling one of the brothers aside who was there and said, "Look, you're going to have to stop putting your wet towel on the bedstead." You know, he didn't put it there anymore because it makes marks on it. I can remember her telling a couple of them, "You know, you got to pick up your clothes. You can't scatter your clothes all over the room." And so what happened was she began to develop house rules. And now if you come to our house, you know where the towels are, you know where you put them when you're finished, you know the list. And everything just works smoothly. And I can imagine Priscilla saying the same thing. "Timothy, pick up your clothes. I'm not your maid." Now, Silas is an example. This guy, somebody taught him right. Those kind of conversations going on. Maybe they had nicknames for each other. I imagined Timothy and Silas giving Priscilla the nickname of maybe Mama Prisca. Think so? My wife gets all kinds of nicknames. It's the intimacy, the building of a relationship and fellowship that draws close, that says, you are very, very special. It's the thrill of making new friends and all their stories. You know, all of us want our stories told. Now, a lot of people say to me, I'm pretty private, but down beneath, down low, they want their story told because the fellowship depends on it. I'll be 70, I'll say it this way. I turned 71 this year. And we just had a guy, he's 28, he got his master's from Texas A&M, got an internship and a fellowship at Harvard. He's going to begin to pursue his PhD there. Very great young man. Well, he lives in Boston. He doesn't have a car. I live in Concord. I go into Alston, Brighton, come back out to Natick, take him from Natick back to Alston, Brighton, and back to Concord. That's a 75-mile round trip. However, I knew if I get to spend that much time in the car with this guy, we're going to get to some stories. And so, you know, we're going back and forth. I'm sharing my life with him, talking about our church and our fellowship and what we're doing, and fired up. And it's not very long until he begins to tell me his story. And it's an amazing story about how God got him to Natick and why he had to be at Natick. There's quite an age span between the two of us, but not in our fellowship. We're building great stories. We had a guy, a brother who, how long ago it was now, maybe year and a half or so ago, would come in, sit in the back row with his little boy. And before I could get to him, he was gone. Well, this happened over and over for a couple of months or so, and finally grabbed him. And went out to lunch, and come to find out, excuse me, raised in the church, educated in the Boston area, has an amazing knowledge, an amazing faith. And I said, Greg, have you ever taught Bible class? He said, no, never. Nobody ever asked me. He's kind of a timid kind of guy. I said, well, guess what? Things just changed. He's an amazing teacher. He now does our Wednesday nights. And I constantly remind him of that story about how God laid hands on him. The fellowship. It's drawing and finding out people's stories, because it's in the fellowship that's where the stories are told. And then it's the treasure of old friends, because new friends become old friends. And they go with you to the end. When my mother died, I have a very dear old friend. He's the old guy that we ran up Fool's Hill together with. His name is Dan. And he loved my mother, spent a lot of time at our house. I spent a lot of time at his house. And some circumstances that surrounded my mother's death really discouraged my daughter. She's a Christian. Family stuff and all of that, and she was so discouraged, and just really down. And so Dan and my daughter's name is Michael and I met at a restaurant for dinner. But she may have met him once briefly. So we sit down, we're having a nice time, and then my friend Dan starts telling Dad's stories. I'm going, oh no, oh wait a minute, we're not going there, wait. And this is under the title of New Friends Become Old Friends, and how important those old stories are. He said to my daughter, let me tell you a story about your dad in high school. He was dating this young lady, and her old boyfriend kept messing with her. My daughter's like this, He said, so one night we just decided we'd go over to his house, and your dad was going to go up on the porch to kick his behind, only he didn't use those words. And my daughter says, Dad! My friend Dan said, and I was going to hide in the bushes, so if he needed help, I could come running. Drew my daughter into her dad's old life from his old friend, settled things. We had the greatest evening because of an old friend telling an old story about her dad. Now you think about it. We'll get into all the stuff that went on in Corinth. Paul, Silas, and Timothy are not great house gifts because they cause and stir up a great conflict. And it comes home to Mama Prisca and Aquila. I'm sure they were involved in it as well. But the stories that started there, we hear way later on, because in Romans 16, Paul says, you greet Prisca and Aquila, because they laid their necks on the line for me, as they did all the churches of the Gentiles. He's referring back to what happened in Corinth, right in their own house. That very thing, and we'll see as we go on a little bit, what happened in Corinth established and caused Paul to be able to continue on in his missionary journey responsibilities. So these new friends will cultivate old stories. Last Monday of this week, I got a call from a fellow I had not heard from in about almost 20 years. He's an orthopedic surgeon a hand surgeon, who took his family to Phnom Penh back in the mid-90s, right when a coup was about over and the Sihanouk regime took back over Cambodia. And there'd been a hospital built there called the Prince Sihanouk Hospital. And so Graham and his family went there because of all the amputees, because of the landmines in Cambodia. And he was a dear friend. So I became Graham Gumley in this country. Power of attorney, guardian of his children, executor of his estate. I sold 2 houses, rented those 2 houses before they were sold 2 cars, did his taxes, managed his assets, balanced his checkbook, worked with his CPA for 4 years. Looking back on it, I don't know how I did that. So as we were sitting and having coffee, they began to tell the stories about how they could not have done what they did had God not used me to manage their lives in the United States. That took me back to a time that said God was doing things that I could not have arranged, didn't even realize the impact of them, didn't even know how I was going to get it done. Those stories, and as of Monday, propelled me on. New friends become old friends, and old friends go with you to the end. That's the carencia, where the stories are that bring you back to the power of what God is doing, because there were a lot of God stories that came out of that meeting over a cup of coffee. The second point of this text is hospitality. First of all, let me read verses 2 and 3. I didn't do that. Paul comes to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. So he's staying with them, beginning his ministry and his outreach. And then Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, and Paul was occupied with the word, but testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on I shall go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus. And so, we'll stop there for just a second. It's that hospitality that's so very important, that's part of building the stories and the fellowship. Because when you sit around the dinner table, you tell stories. And you laugh. And sometimes you cry. And sometimes you gain some insight. And sometimes you're just inspired. And Silas and Timothy arrive, and all the stories begin to be told. And there's a Spanish phrase called como había antes, which means how they were before, with an eye open to the future. And so, in these table conversations, in this hospitality, the building of stories, they have an impact that will go years into the future. And I can tell you that I know this for fact by faith. The Bible doesn't say it, but I know it by faith. That Priscilla and Aquila told the Corinthian story over and over. And they laughed at Silas and Timothy and Paul. They wept as they did back around that table in the fellowship. And as they told those stories, people were telling them to, thought, man, those old stories, yeah, but those old stories opened up what would become. As an older guy, I've got to tell my younger brothers and sisters my stories. Got to tell them the stories. Because that's where they hear the God stories of God working. Now, many times we don't want to do that because it's prideful, arrogant, and I'm calling attention to myself. That doesn't matter in the fellowship because the ground is level. Fellowship has its stories. We got to tell it. If we're telling it, God will draw people to our church because these people need to hear those kind of stories. They hear all kinds of junk stories. They hear all kinds of worldly stories and all kinds of stuff. They don't ever get to hear the God stories. But they do in our fellowship because that's what we're sharing and what we're doing. Third point I want to make is called the ministry. So number one was new friends become old friends. Number two is the hospitality where those stories are built. And number three is the ministry. Beginning in verse 6, it says, "And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles.' And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, he said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. I got a lot of people in this city.' It's the only place where God had to intervene because Paul was fearful. Not sin, not a negative thing. There were people being baptized. There was opposition that was rising. Imagine what it was like when he and Silas and Timothy went back to Mama Prisca and Aquila's that night, or every night. Imagine them praying and begging God for their safety. Thanking God that they could put their necks on the line for Paul. Not really knowing that they were being prepared and building stories for the work in Ephesus, for the work in all the churches of the Gentiles, and then finally back in Rome. See, I think we need to get us a God story book and start writing the stories down. There's so many of them going around in our fellowship that you're going to forget them if you don't jot them down. I have one. And I can review and go through that and sort of, skim the top of it. And I'm encouraged every single time I do that. It inspires me to tell the stories. I have 2 grandsons. And I can tell you that they hear my stories and Janet's stories over and over and over again. It's as if they are there. So in the ministry, they've got some stories. Paul will stay a year and a half in Corinth. And I assume he stayed a year and a half with Priscilla and Aquila. Because in the ministry, there are new stories that always keep happening. And those new stories always endure. I have a picture of a snowstorm in Lubbock. Snowed about 18 inches. Well, that just stops everything. And I had an old 1967 GMC truck pickup. It was beat up. And so in this snow, I think there were 10 of us actually that decided we were going to shovel snow in the bed of that truck, get in it and drive around, throw snowballs at people. And I have a picture that shows Mickey Elrod standing right up behind the cab with her coat on with this smile that said, I'm about to have some fun. Also in that picture is a young lady that was met at a Pizza Hut. She was a prostitute. She lived with us for a month or so. She was baptized. Don't know whatever happened to her. But she's standing up in the back of that truck looking like, what in the world am I doing here? And the brothers standing around or whatever. So we were driving around throwing snowballs at innocent people. And all of a sudden this police cruiser comes up right behind us. Lights, I mean, it's like we're about to get thrown into the Hoosgal forever. He admonished us severely. So we shoveled the snow back out of the bed of the pickup. I say that to say that was part of the ministry. It was the fellowship that we had in doing that kind of thing. Baxter Black was a veterinarian in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He became a bit of a songwriter, storyteller, philosopher. And he tells a story about little Joe the Wrangler. He and his brother, every night, or quite often, his dad would come in and tell them this same story over and over and over again about little Joe the Wrangler. And as the story goes, this little preteen guy comes into a cattle camp on his pony. They were herding this herd of cows. And he was there because his mom had died and his dad had married, and his stepmother beat him, so he left. And so the cowboys, the wranglers there, called him Little Joe the Wrangler, and they said, you can stay, we'll feed you, and you can stay over with us till we get some things worked out. A couple of nights later, the thunder started, the lightning started, rain was going, the herd was becoming unsettled, and finally they stampeded. And so the wranglers were trying to herd them up because there was an arroyo not far away. This is Baxter Black's dad telling the story with two little boys listening intently. And somewhere way on the other side, there was a little figure on a small pony driving hard to turn the herd to keep them out of the arroyo. After the herd was settled down and came back, they couldn't find little Joe the Wrangler and his pony. The next morning they found them in the arroyo, dead. Baxter Black says, I never knew why my dad told us that story over and over again. Till he said one time later, I realized that he told that story so that we could become part of what little Joe was doing and say to ourselves, we could have done that. I could have done that. I could have been the hero. I could have the courage. That's why he did it. See, that's why we have to tell our stories, because those coming along with us and behind us need to say, Johnny, I could have done that. I can do what you just did. What an amazing story. God could do that with me. He could do that with me. Our fellowship builds that kind of thing. A couple more stories about that were news stories at one time. In 1969, I was 21 years old, and I was selling Bibles for the Southwestern Company, which was in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was in Rankin County, Mississippi, outside of Jackson. And I was up in Canton, Mississippi, and I knocked on a Church of Christ preacher's door by the name of David Wade. He invited me back for dinner that night. That was surely a good sale. Studied the Bible with me, and I was baptized about 1 a.m. Maybe saw him once or twice after that. Didn't talk with him, couldn't find him, didn't know where he was for years and years. And 3 years ago, because of the internet, and all of that, I found David Wade. Found where he'd preached, got in touch with one of the elders, told him my story, and he had a great chuckle out of it, gave me David's cell phone number, and I called it. He now lives in Tennessee. When I called him, I caught him on the road with his wife, and I said, David Wade, there's no way you remember who I am. My name is Mike Hammonds. And he said, oh, I know who you are. I remember you. He said, you've been an illustration in a number of my sermons. He said, in fact, I have a sermon entitled, I Baptized the Bible Salesman. Have a brother who moved into the Natick Church, a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. An amazing fella. Organized administrator, holds you accountable, just the kind of guy I needed in my life. So there was a young couple that we had met, and and they were just a great couple. I mean, you just knew, man, these people are going to hear the gospel. And so kept trying to get with them, and just one thing after another, never was able to get back with them. 6 months. And so my colonel, I said, I'm going to get in touch with them, and I said, I'm going to try it again and see if I can get with them. He said, no, I don't want you to do that. He said, we're just wasting time. That's not a good use of your time. So I said, well, I'm just going to do it one more time. Well, it was that time that we had lunch, set up a study, and they'd be baptized several months later. So I give my colonel the credit for converting this couple. And he shakes his head. What are you talking about? I said, well, if you hadn't told me not to do it, I wouldn't have tried to prove you wrong, and I probably would not have made the contact. So I'm giving you credit. See the stories? Those are the stories that build our fellowship, that are part of our fellowship. They just are so very good. So it's the building of the God stories that are so very important in the ministry. Share one more with you. We have a brother who helps me preach. Not helps me preach, he pushes me, and he's a great preacher. Grew up and his dad had 2 families. He used to drive his dad around in Boston. He was 10 or 11 years old. His dad had a wrecking company. He'd drive his dad around because his dad was drunk. When his dad died, he was cremated, nobody wanted his ashes. So my brother took them and stored them in his locker at work. His dad died in 1995. All that time his ashes were in my brother's locker. So he was preaching earlier this year, and we talked about his dad and about what he needed to do and all. And so he's preaching, and then he says, Matthew's sitting in the back of the auditorium. He said, bring my box up. So Matthew comes walking up, and he's got this gold box. It's got his dad's name on it. My brother takes the box and he says, it's time to bury Norman. What a story. The fellowship and the stories of the fellowship allowed my brother to get to a point where he could walk into areas in his life that he'd never, ever opened up to walk into. And now he's part of the fellowship and the stories, and he can tell his story. How about you? willing to tell your story to the fellowship? That's where you get the God stories. And then finally, in verse 9 of chapter 18, God says to Paul, don't be afraid. Go on speaking, don't be silent. And so here's the pressure of the ministry. You know, we sometimes downplay the pressure of the ministry. Sometimes the pressure of the ministry can be like a pressure cooker. Time, things I need to deal with. I call it the messes. I got a little pile here, one over here, and one there, and it's just all a bunch of little piles of messes, and it's just driving me nuts. So the pressures of the ministry happen. You're studying with someone, counting the cost. You're training a new Christian. You're helping them to learn to live like a Christian, struggling through the things that they drug into the church from a former life, even though they put off the old person. Praying about it, heavy on your heart. Somebody's struggling, there's somebody sick, somebody is about to die. Somebody needs encouragement. It's the pressures of the ministry. And God's saying to you, don't fear. You're not going to die. In fact, what's happening is you're building a story that the fellowship needs. And here's the question. In the fellowship, with regard to the stories, who needs a care package? Who needs a package that's got salsa roja in it? Who needs a stack of tortillas? A phrase in Spanish that describes that is, todavía tienen tanto que decirnos para el tiempo en que vivimos. Which means there's still so much for you to tell us for the time in which we live. So much to tell us in this fellowship at this time. Mi iglesia querida, my dear beloved Ovilla Church. The place I can't get back to quick enough. It's my haunt. I want to die there. All my stories surround that. And the pressures of the ministry are what produces the old friends with the best stories of all. Stories help us get in touch with who we are and what God is doing. I'm going to close with this. My daughter wrote a piece about my dad when he died. My daughter's a Christian. And she described his cadencia, if you will. I took a trip with my dad to Tahoka, Texas. He'd never told us much about where he was born and his upbringing, except Jack, his mule that he rode to school every day. And not long before he died, he and I took a trip over to Tahoka, and the old farmhouse is still there with very little modification. And he began to tell me some of the stories that surrounded that. If you've never been to Tahoka, Texas, there's not a lot there. And my daughter wrote, I was doing laundry at the laundromat when Arthur died. And so it's the way of things. Some will be doing chores when others wander on home. He was born in Tahoka, Texas. His veins and his heart were tattooed in West Texas dirt, as are mine, she says. Markings, designs out of grit and sand that go unnoticed until one feels an internal thirst that only God knows how to relieve. A thirst that pulls you back to the places where you're lost in land and sky and family made up of healers, cowboys, a few preachers, markings that lead you back home. So now at Tahoka, wind blows Arthur's dusty soul out into the places that he played, walked his donkey, sat on porches, out to the Pacific where he sailed and fought to become a man, to the first sip of Mountain Dew and a piece of bubble gum. It's the same wind that blew him into being, the wind that took those before him, and the wind that will take those after him. It's the way of things. That describes the emotion, the feelings, the connectedness, the acceptance of our church in Ovilla. Think on these things and commit to let God tell His story through you. To Him be the glory in our church.